All right, I'm all set up here. We're on our second week. I hope you enjoyed last week's experience as we work through pop culture and all the different venues that we're looking at. Continue to do all of the posts and look at all the videos. And if you have any questions, again, I want to remind you that you can contact me at these contact numbers and emails. So this week we are talking about music and popular culture. And the first thing I want you to think about is the soundtrack of your life. Because we all in this modern era have some sense of music in the back of our head. Sometimes we can't even pinpoint why a song jumps into our memory as we see or experience life, but we often have a place that we pick out a song. Maybe it's representative of a time in our life, or maybe it's something we heard when we were getting our hair done, or maybe it's something that expresses the emotion you're going through. But this is something that is part of our everyday life, and we don't even think about it. And I want you to take a moment to think about what your soundtrack really does sound like. Is there a particular genre? Are you a person who is influenced by your friends' type of music, or are you a person that is up and against society and what they call popular? What artists are your favorite? Who is the person right now or the band right now that's defining the way you feel, whether it be when you want to be picked up or whether you want to express feelings of loss or brokenness? These are the soundtracks I'm talking about, things that we use in the form of music to symbolize how we're feeling and interacting with others and how that's been influenced over time. In modern society, music does play a central role in developing culture. And we have to recognize that music has been around in millennia of generations as a developing tool of culture. However, the sense of the playlist that we're being born with in a particular way where we have video and image and ideas about the band that are real were not something that has been part of culture in its perpetuity because we've had a sense of the last 100 years of developing popular culture with modern technology and understanding that we curate as we gain more independence with our own tools rather than just using the tools and the systems of cultures that are typically much more mechanical is how it would have been expressed in Durkheim's language, which we'll talk a little bit about today. You have the ability with the online access that most of us have to curate a much wider list and also to recognize that you have a larger role to play in a capitalist society about how you participate, as we talked about last week. Pop music often takes up a significant amount of space in our playlist. Not all of you may say automatically pop is the background because some of you may be into classical music or punk or some sort of alternative music. It's something that isn't always the case. However, because you do go into spaces, whether you shop or whether you, like I said earlier, get your hair cut or whether you are at a concert, pop music plays in the background all the time. It tends to be what we hear the most. It's not like an elevator music playlist, although it's really interesting. If you go into Olive Garden, they will have a jazz singer singing, Every Breath You Take uh, by the Police. And so it does bleed into itself, as I've said earlier. But your playlist, whether you choose to have pop music be part of it, is often something that is imposed on you. This wasn't the case 100 years ago. Just to keep that in mind, that people often related to the music that was culture. And sure, there, for example, in our history, we had cowboy songs in some places and people expressing their culture through instrumentation. But as far as being able to curate a huge list, that often included people being in proximity of each other or having access to each other, and people weren't able to move around as much. It was just not there was no automobile. There was just thinking of that whole idea of how we do life today in the modern age, and we just didn't have that available to us. There are lots of different timelines that express what's going on in popular music and what we look at as far as all the different styles. If you go online, you can see all kinds of timelines that look at pop music, jazz, punk, metal, all of that, and how it developed. The one thing that we do know is that with the invention of the radio and the gramophone, which is the earlier uh, record player, these types of experiences were developed out of the experience of technology making the airwaves available. And so we go back to about 1930, really, as the time that larger cultures were able to hear and listen to different forms of music other than the music that they'd been raised with. And so we start to see around 1950 where TVs, radio, and people having the automobile available are able to develop different formats of music that other generations, cultures can experience. And so that starts to create a society that, in Durkheim's term, would be more organic in the fact that we adopt all of this and see this as normal, but it hadn't been, as I said, 100 years before. Over time, we have influencers. For example, you weren't born automatically knowing what you liked, although you may have reacted in the womb to certain kinds of sounds. But we do think about, as we look through this lens, how we were developed individually so that we can understand how large groups are developing, and how, with all the people on the planet, we have influencers, and then we see ourselves eventually learning to curate our own form of playlist. I'm using myself as an example. I was born in 1969, the Woodstock era. Now, my family, I was the youngest in the family, and so my family wasn't built around that type of music. In fact, my parents' music were they developed their style around the 40s and 50s. And think of Bobby socks and smoking cigarettes and white T-shirts, and that was my mom and dad in El Dorado, Kansas. And Hank Williams was their favorite singer, but they were into the crooner, and they can attest to all kinds of music that they listened to as kids that influenced who they listened to. They listened to a lot of country, but they developed tastes over time that crossed across the lines. But that was different than my oldest sister, who she was an interesting person. She was developed with three holes in her heart. And she also was a person who had what's called Turner syndrome, which is opposite of Downs. But she was really functional in society. My parents raised her in a way that she had access to schools and things that were able to develop her sense of her own self. And she had strong tastes. And when she was home, um, there were a lot of times that I would listen to 70s music coming from her room, Donnie and Marie, Captain and Tennille, that kind of genre. My next oldest sister was a little bit older than Jill. She was born, I think, in 58, and she had more tastes like bread, which is not a food, it's an actual group. John Denver, Gordon Lightfoot, very 70s, what I would call uh, 70s easy kind of listening a lot of the time. And then my brother came along. He was born in 63, and he loved Kansas, Boston, Peter Frampton, the Eagles. And so my soundtrack of life was around all of this kind of music. And then, of course, when I began to choose Madonna, Queen, Michael Jackson, Foreigner, Styx, all kinds of things from my peers started to develop my soundtrack. But all of these are part of my soundtrack. And so I want you to think about your own soundtrack. Who was playing on your radio on the album? What did you have, a console stereo? Did you have a big stereo? Did they have CDs, cassette tapes, whatever? that helps us to define individually who we are, and then we can see more how society works together. So the other thing that's important as we look at this is that we're building our life playlist, and we know it's not an isolated experience, but we also have to recognize when we are sociologists, we're not thinking just about ourselves individually. We're using that sociological imagination that we talked about last week to say, okay, if this is true for me, that my playlist has been completely shaped by people and what's available to me, then this might be true for others as well. And then how often does that breach into our everyday life, where how much are we really choosing? And our music reflects our social world as well, where we live, how we have been raised, the amount of um, opportunities and the amount of resources that we might have, and class. And I was raised in a family where I was the first person to complete uh, four-year undergrad, and then went on to get my master's, and now I'm working on my PhD. But my dad was a truck driver, and my mom was a secretary, and our life had more of a working class to lower to middle class, depending on in the time of their life. Um, where we were living was Derby, Kansas, and everything in Derby was always behind Kansas City or any place else. So I found out when I moved that didn't have as much opportunity to find different kinds of music. So these are the things that I want you to think about. How is building your life playlist like that? It's not isolated. And so the other thing I think is that we have to recognize that we are people who have to imagine ourselves in um, a larger group. Some of the things that we're not even aware of, as far as how our music is embedded into our lifestyle every day. And Emil Durkheim, who is the major theorist we'll study today, coined the term collective conscience, which means we are operating as a group that creates and sustains this identity, as our playlists look more alike, but we may not know the people. We just have a sense of identity with people who might lift up that they love 50 Cent, and I can't say that correctly, so obviously I'm not listening to him as often, but that right there, when I say that, puts me in a different group. But when I listen to people, like right now, I love Snail Mail, and this is a person that's kind of a young person I think is a creative genius, that I know what that identity is, this young kind of indie type genius. That gives me collective conscience with those listeners. And so we have to recognize also then that because that collective conscious is something that's out there, that industries have developed around this collective consciousness and develop an entire list of playlists that are part of that organic idea that this is just normal. This is what people do with music. It's always been there, when in fact it hasn't. And so those industries, for example, point us to the means of production in music, that there's so many people employed by music and the music industry, and mostly the pop music scene, because that's where you make most of your money. But Sony Corp employed 130,000 people in 2015, and that's just thinking about the employment of their artists and their developers. But there are so many subsidiaries. I can't even tell you. There really are millions of people who make their living or supplement their lives through music. And when we look at this, again, through our lens of this week, which we'll talk more about functionalism, I'm just kind of giving you some ideas before we get into the idea. There's a machine out there. We call it the music machine. And it is created to perpetuate that music. It's created to see how that normalcy of this is organic solidarity. This is just how it operates. It's always been that way. We often hear people say that when it really hasn't. And we don't see an end to it. We see this machine being challenged, which we'll talk about next week with critical theory, but there's no idea of really the beginning and the ending of it in our brains because we just have been raised around it. And so this means a production of music, whether you're a person who's a sound engineer or whether you're a person who cleans the studios, or if you're a roadie, or if you're a person who is actually um, making music, or if you're a person who creates the websites, all of that is built into this means of production of music, and it's part of our everyday life. And there's a collective conscience built around that as well. So I've been hinting at this all week. This is the start of our theory week. Last week we kind of got the introduction to everything, but theory is what gives us the ability to look at this larger perspective. I mean, it's just too huge without an idea of a lens being used to look at this. So theory helps us to narrow our gaze so that we can have a conversation about this, because we could, you know, spend all 6 weeks just on collective conscience. And so it's important for us to recognize that we're not going to get at everything, but I think it'll be interesting as you do your different types of discussions on this. First, we're going to look at functional this week and use that lens to look at what music and how music, and especially pop music, plays a major role in our playlists in life and creates a sense of solidarity in society, which is what functionalism is about. Next week, we'll talk about critical theory, and we're going to use that to look at movie industry, a little bit more about how we do TV. I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't see that, but because we've changed how we even get to series, and understanding that many people don't have cable anymore. A lot of people watch YouTube. So we'll use critical theory to look at those venues. And then finally, interactional, which will help us a little bit with understanding social media and recognizing fashion. Really, fashion is what we're going to look at that more, so that we can kind of see how that interacts. And then we're going to use all three really to look at social media. But interactional fashion often happens with social media, especially how we do our bodies, as we look at how we alter ourselves and presentation of self. So we'll talk about that in the third week. So the next 3 weeks we're doing that. And I want to give you a reminder of the theories a little bit. We'll go into that each time. Reminder of the theories, and I want you to use these theories, by the way, in your posts. Make sure, if we're talking about functionalism one week, that you actually know these theories and are using that lens to look at that, because that helps us with developing your portfolio and how eventually you're going to pick a theory and look at that whole group that you're studying for this 6 weeks. Okay, reminder of theory. This is Emile Durkheim. You're going to notice something. All of the people that are presented are white European males. Sociology has a deep embedded practice in Western European thought. And so that, again, is something critical theory will come at next week a little bit more. And I tried to create some diversity in our readings. I just wanted to make sure that we both balanced out where we've come from and who's had the mic for this, which is typically white male academics. We call them dead white males right now because none of them are living, but they also gave us the formative thoughts that we started from. So the reminder theory is functional. We often attribute to the founding theorist is Emile Durkheim. Of course, he was influenced by other folks, but he's the one that gives us the most set of definitions that we tend to still use. He asks the question, how does society function? That's what functional theories do. They assume that there's a function. Theorists here tend to think that there is function and dysfunction. How do cultures operate in society? And that recognizes that there are subcultures that are working, and as long as function is working, and they wouldn't necessarily have as much difficulty with class or cultural differences, because they see that as a role that is something that helps keep society together. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And how do we collect social facts, meaning things that we can document about society to test their function? You know, what role, for example, does music play, and what are the facts out there that we can constantly turn to tell us that this is what and how music and pop music is working. And one of the ways I think that is easiest to see is the amount of money that people spend going to a concert, for example, or the amount of money that people spend on the amounts of music that they purchase, whether it be using a downloadable system like Amazon Prime or something like that. They're still spending money monthly to be able to have access to that. And so those are facts that we can cumulatively look at and then put them up against demographics of different types of cultures and society, and from that get a picture of how that functions. So the underlying question of all of it is, what's the glue that holds us together? And in music, how is that glue exercised? Another reminder of our theories, next week we'll look at critical theory. I just want to give you an overview of this. Karl Marx is the major theorist that we attribute to this idea, and it evaluates power disparity between cultures and groups, and especially who are our cultural producers when we think about music. And also next week we'll be talking about movies and video and series. How do the cultural producers reify inequality, and how do those empower the elite maintain that disparity to their own gain? Marx, if we remember, was talking about industrial revolution and the development of capitalism, and so he has a lot of questions about how and who defines our history and our current conditions based on their own history, because they're in power, so they have the power to produce what we think we know. And Karl Marx will say we need to look at other cultures and recognize that there are multiple lenses in which to look at this, and that power is at the center of that. The third theory we'll look at is interaction, and the major person that we need to think about here is George Herbert Mead. Interactionists examine the symbols and language. It's kind of this in between. They still have a critical eye about imbalance of power, but why do we do that? But they also see the function of it. And so there's an examining of how we've developed our taste, or what is the meaning that we give to the symbols and language that we use. How do rituals develop, and how do people see themselves through these rituals? So for example, how is it that we've developed a sense of style in music, and what are the things that we see in the styles of music that we've chosen that have symbolism and meaning to us? If a person is listening to folk music, why is modern folk giving meaning? What group tends to identify with that? Whereas urban types of music, for example, if we think of Latinx, Latino music, and we think of how it might express things even culturally different based on family's origin or region of their Spanish-speaking selves, there's a lot of difference. So people often lump that together, whereas they're very different rituals and very different expressions of Tejano versus other kinds of music. And so we've got to recognize how those roles play a definition and identity. And then how we create meaning by interaction with each other and the symbols is really important in interactionism, that we affect each other, and studying those symbols gives us an idea of why did those symbols come to play. And again, George Herbert Mead was the founding theorist. This week, you're reading The Stranger, and George Simmel is a functionalist. He hung out with Durkheim and also with Max Weber a lot in Germany. Just to give you a little summary, but I want you to read the whole thing. I know it's a bit deep, but that's the challenge of looking at this with a sociological perspective. His influential essay, The Stranger, gives us the category of the stranger as a social function within groups, meaning we do identify ourselves comparing ourselves to the other, and often to people in power, and maybe even wanting to use that stranger to be part of our group. Because, for example, you might be a person that's listening to Ed Sheeran on a regular basis, in this English singer-songwriter, and his story, you may not be from the UK, but there's this sense of him as a stranger to you in that sense. But there's also the stranger of, you may hate Ed Sheeran music. You may think he's the worst singer-songwriter, and it just gags you out. He plays the more important role there for you to say that your dissimilar ideas of that wanderer who comes and goes. You can't help but interact with other people that tend to have uh, an idea that this is the best songwriter in the world, and so there's a lot of power put behind Ed Sheeran's music. So the stranger for Simmel is one who's within the bounds of society, but wasn't so from the beginning. Um, this might be actually seen as really the Ed Sheeran group is the in group right now because of how much money his concerts have yielded, and people listening to other music other than Ed Sheeran would be considered the stranger. It can be flipped in lots of different ways, but I want you to be able to interact with that and to think about the stranger, the one outside the group that helps identify what's going on in the major group, especially when we're talking about pop culture and who's popular. With these theories in mind and using again David Grazian's Mix It Up Popular Culture, Mass Media, and Society, we'll explore a theory a week for the next 3 weeks to observe and critique the chosen areas of popular culture that we've put out there. And so, again, I'm bringing it back with music as a functional lens to think about this theory, mostly um, identified by Emil Durkheim, this theory of functionalism, and ask yourself, and use this throughout the description of your posts and your assignments. What is the function of music? And use these theories, but also interact with them. How does music operate to promote functional cohesion of society? What is the glue in popular music? What needs to be present to make it popular? And that may be something that you don't buy into, again, with your vote, but it is popular there. What are the things that have to be present that you've observed? As Grazian highlights in his text, Durkheim helps us first to understand the role of the sacred and the profane. This is a picture of a Coldplay concert, and everybody I know that goes to Coldplay concerts see it as a religious experience. they feel more connected to the world. And here's this whole group of people. Just look at this audience alone. They don't know each other, but they're involved in that cohesion of this experience. And it feels set apart and transcendent. And this doesn't have to do with whether you are religious, believe that there is a God or gods, believe that there's even a sense of um, anything but you just live this life and you're done. I mean, that's not what sacred means in the terms of sociological perspective. It's that people have an experience that's transcendent, and they identify these terms as in holy language and in that symbolism. And there's a sense of unifying, and that's not something that is something you can do every day. You really put your effort into going to this event, creating this one-time experience, just like we talked about last week. We have these experiences, and it's a sign of popular culture that when you're in this experience, you were there and you were part of this group, even though you probably only were there with 5 people or even one other person or by yourself. You were with this group, and it was a transcendent experience, and Durkheim would call that sacred. Profane, then, is the everyday, mundane, normal existence, things that we do every day. So you may be listening to Coldplay every day, and it may not give you that sense of transcendence every single time, but if you've been to the concerts, or maybe there is a particular song that just constantly comes back, Waterfall or something that uh, Paradise or something like that that just goes back, or the old stuff, The Scientist Is Mine. I love that song, and I go back and listen to that every day, and I feel that sense of the sacred. But there's other songs by him that it's just like, yeah, it's part of my everyday life. But this is what we're talking about when we look at the function of that we need the sacred, that there is a human sense of needing something that's transcendent and above our everyday mundane lives. And Durkheim would say that that's an important part of being human, and what allows groups to hang out together and actually create society. And this becomes what we call the collective conscience. And the collective conscience is something as we went back earlier, that collective conscience turns into something different. It's not just that you're part of a group because you listen to a group, or that people put tons of money and essence into their own lives, that eventually larger numbers, larger amounts of money develop and create then a popular culture around that band or that person. But then there's, in these larger experiences, a collective effervescence. And I love that sound, effervescence. It just sounds like you're popping a pop can of, and it's a shared feeling of identity in which we as individuals and members of a group experience that wave of emotion. And that it's that sense that we need that sense of revived emotion. And whether you're a person who finds yourself being emotional every day, or you find yourself being a person that doesn't show your emotions, in this space it's safe for you to do that, and you feel that wave and it connects you. And a lot of times then that effervescence plays a large role in our lives. For example, I felt like this recently. Oh, by the way, this is also something that creates a solidarity with the group. It's a ritual of solidarity, where that shared experience creates that sacred moment, and it then bonds you together in society. So no matter what, if you went to that Coldplay concert and you are a Coldplay fan and you had that experience, from that point on, you're part of that larger group. That is a collective group of people that you're in the uh, the solidarity of that moment, even if you have completely different views on how to, vote or do political society, or come from different classes or different racial backgrounds or groups. In that moment, your part is to be part of that moment, and that creates that bond. I went and saw the movie yesterday, and I'm not going to tell you the plot. Obviously, if you see the trailers, it's about one night, goes completely blank, and one guy remembers all of the Beatles songs and nobody else remembers it. And so he is a singer songwriter, and he decides to present the Beatles to the world in his own way. A lot of times, I'll go to a movie and it's the big, huge event. Like we were there opening day of the last Avengers movie. And it was this amazing ritual solidarity of people exploding online about that. Whereas yesterday is the simple, I mean, I just loved it. It was amazing to experience this entire movie based around the pop culture icon setters, the Beatles, but they weren't necessarily present in a way. It was this very subtle experience. So there's kind of this subculture feeling of other people in the audience, and it's not packed, but there is a situation of, I feel like I was there to represent that this movie is really good. And there's a bond that comes from people who are like, this is an important movie, that is different than the bond about the entire universe of Marvel coming to a head about this series that they just did. And it's something that they're both rituals of solidarity, but they still have different types of sacredness to them. So that's kind of something I want you to lift up. The ritual of solidarity, also using music, isn't always dedicated to the venue of music. For example, going to that movie called Yesterday, um, I it was all about music, but it was like movie. It was a movie, so I'm getting this solidarity through the Beatles music and the idea of what's going on, but it's bled over, really, to uh, my experience of the music through video. The same can be said about things like college and pro games. They're not about the music, but music is a bonding and ritual creating experience. When people sing "We Are the Champions," that is ritual creating. That is a sense of solidarity, and there's an organic feel like this is what we're supposed to do. We always sing this song, and it creates that organic feel like it's always been there. Rock Chalk or Wabash Cannonball for KU or K State, you hear those rituals, and it's passed off generation to generation. Now, this isn't, I have a video here. I don't think I can get to it. Let's see if it will go. I don't know if it will go. Yeah, it is going to go. Very cool. I want you to listen just a little bit to it, but I've got the link to it too. This was in 2014. And this video had a sense of who we are. Listen to it for a second.
I'm tired of waiting my turn and never taking the lead. I'm rising out of the earth. I know my time, I will not follow. I won't rewind, cause they told me that my time is right now.
First off, I wanna say welcome. I think I hear a buzz and I know it ain't your cell phone. That's the sound of a black and gold nation. Hornets get loud so they can hear what we're saying. Right now is the time and the place is here, so I wanna hear Emporia cheer. We want it right now and we're not gonna wait. So put your fingers up, Emporia stay.
All right, so that's that feeling of being part of the Emporia State Nation. And that is a music situation where there's solidarity in the music, but you might feel this emotional pull, like, oh, that's us. And listen to the whole thing. I've got it linked on the Canvas page, so you can go there. What this creates then is a sense of imagined community. You don't know everybody at Emporia State. Nobody does. If they do, they've got an amazing ability to know millions of people or that have been involved in Emporia State since its inception. You may run into many alumni, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of people that are part of that community, and part of our community is built on that imagined sense of we're not necessarily, there's not physical proximity, but it doesn't limit our ability to feel like we're part of that community. And this music or the rituals of our music and the rituals of these types of things create that imagined community. That once we run into a person that is from ESU, then we're always part of that group. So these are the main concepts presented to us by Emil Durkheim. So make sure to highlight that if you're lifting up these terms. And part of the idea of functionalism, what the function of music is through the lens of Emil Durkheim's theory, is that it creates a collective conscience when we are involved in these larger ideas, even though at the time Emil was writing this, there was no such thing as pop culture, really. There was no such thing as pop music. It still speaks to us today that we create a collective conscience, that we are part of something when we follow a group or a band or a particular style. There's a recognition that there's sacred and profane moments, and there are times where that sacred is maybe something about the emotion that we feel and the large amount of experience that we can get by following a band, and especially if you go to a concert or some sort of a venue, or let's say you've picked out a prom song and or your class song or whatever, that there's a sense of sacredness that goes to the heart, that it's transcendent and it's different than your everyday experience of music or how it plays part in society. Then you have a collective effervescence, which is that wave of emotion. And often with pop culture, that's what they're working on, is that wave of emotion. And they know that that's part of the function of creating, in especially a capitalist society, the venue that people will buy into of that music, and then revenue will come from that. And it creates entire job industries for that. And it creates rituals of solidarity where we memorize these types of rituals, and we feel like it's organic and it's just part of who we are, and it's been around there forever. And then finally, it creates imagined community where you may not be in proximity with a bunch of people that are experiencing this music, not know their names, but you do know what's expected, and you work together as a community to continue to reify that. Now, there's a lot of times then when we produce a theory that somebody else is going to come along and they will criticize it. So these are the questions that critical theory would probably go against. So however we see the idea of, you may feel like, yeah, I love functionalism, and consider that that might be the lens you want to look through your entire portfolio for your final project through. However, you have to ask these questions as a good sociologist. Does the function such rituals play in society share the entire experience of society? Are, are, are the representations of what we see on a large scale really representative of what's actually going on in reality? Are these rituals damaging to cultures and groups if they are unable to define the parameters themselves? This is a really important question. You know, who has the power, and does a certain class rule the definitions of what is functional, what isn't? We'll get into that next week with critical theory as we look at the movie industry, as we look at everything that we're looking at for our video venues. I again remind you, thanks again for listening. Remember this throughout the week. Remember to post, have fun, and respond to classmates. This is all about us being online talking about this. I'm reachable at these again. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.